On the 26th of July 2023, Niger burnt hundreds of French flags and the France embassy in their country. They were rebelling against the powers that have held them down for the longest time, and it was now time to move on. But to understand why this sudden coup happened, we'll have to take a history class to understand how France even got to Niger in the first place. In 1898, the French government started making plans to take over Niger, a landlocked country in Africa that now shares borders with over 5 African countries, including Chad, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria. The exploration of the country started as far back as the 1700s because in 1727, Mungo Park, a Scottish explorer, traveled to Niger and wrote a book afterwards. The book was titled Travels in the Interior District of Africa, and he theorized that the river Niger and Congo were one river. Just like the explorers before and after him, African culture and history has been a way of enlarging their pockets. They never really cared to learn about the nation of Niger and wanted to simply capitalize off the area. Mungo Park's theory was disproved as River Niger and Congo were proven to be 2 separate rivers. With people like Mungo Park exploring the peaceful nation of Niger, French officials were motivated to visit the country with the aim of taking whatever they had. European contact with Africa dates as far back as the 15th century, when Portuguese traders made links with West African coastal people. Through the trans-Saharan trade, they bought from and sold things to each other, and Africa had a mildly peaceful relationship with the Europeans. However, their relationship wasn't enough. Do you have those people that you give the benefit of doubt, and instead of appreciating it, they instead strive and fight for more? Yes, that's exactly how the Europeans were. The Europeans started thinking of expansion, religious expansion, trading expansion, expanding their maritime capabilities. For them, Africa showed potential and had possibilities to expand the most powerful European nations, including France. We can say the French are opportunists because they invaded Africa at a time when the continent was suffering from the worst. In the late 16th century, transatlantic trade was popular in Africa, with slaves and natural resources getting moved across borders. By the 18th century, Europeans had solidified their relationship with African slave traders. Slaves were being moved to facilitate the emergence of the New World plantation economies. Islam was expanding in West Africa through jihads, also known as holy wars. But there was nothing holy about those wars, as people who refused to convert were killed. As the New World demand for plantation workers increased, colonial masters began to fight other colonial masters to take over their colonies. Eventually, the Portuguese were overthrown by the French and British to take over its colonies. During the 18th century, the French weren't so involved in slave trade and only stole natural resources like gum arabic and groundnuts. However, they had a slave port in present-day Senegal. Over time, they started viewing their colonies as mere provinces overseas and wanted to expand. They saw how big British and Dutch colonies had expanded and succumbed to the pressure of having more. We can't even say they completely succumbed to pressure because they were already oppressing present-day Senegal, which was known as St. Louis. The French contact with West Africa was focused on Senegal until they decided to move further. One thing that's important to remember is that the British and French worked together to conquer West Africa. Anyway, the French began to move eastward into the Savannah region, and they were led by General Louis Faidherbe. Faidherbe had been appointed as the governor of Senegal in 1854 and didn't waste time in starting his expansionist program. Most of the people that built the French Empire in West Africa were military officials, so they didn't really have a commercial approach. They just wanted land and resources by all means possible, even if it meant enslaving children and assaulting women. As Faiderbe and his successors progressed with their conquest, they met great and sustained resistance, especially in the Segu and Wasulu area. Al-Hajj Umar of the Tukulur Empire of Segu and Almami Samurai of Wasulu fought for the rights of their people. However, pre-colonial African history is so skewed that people are made to believe Africans didn't fight for their right to life and freedom. They are painted as people who sold off their loved ones for basic things like gunpowder and mirrors. Faiderbe extended French's control from Senegal to Gambia, but when you give a certain inch, they go 1,000 miles, and that was the case with this governor of Senegal. His ambitions were big, and the land and resources he had acquired wasn't enough. He wanted to conquer Mali and Niger Delta because he believed they had way more to offer than he was already seeing. But the French government saw that the cost of expanding to new areas was too expensive, and they paused. During this period, it was likely that the nations that weren't already dominated were happy that they were safe. Since the French weren't moving towards them, they could take a break and focus on their lives and trades. But things soon took a dark turn for them as in 1880, the French resumed their conquest. At this point, the Europeans were no longer hiding their intentions to completely dominate the continent. Initially, they were moving step by step, province by province, to take over small towns and villages because they didn't want to appear like they were doing too much. But at the turn of the 1880s, everything changed. In all their might, the Europeans started taking over countries the way they deemed fit. They were fighting with each other for a foreign land, and each European country was hoping to completely take over the entire continent. Noticing the chaos, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck proposed a plan. Now keep in mind that he didn't propose a plan because he was worried that the outright wars between the European countries would hurt people. No, he was concerned about the resources that could get destroyed or lost if the fighting continued. So he proposed a solution. In 1884, he gathered all the European leaders to Berlin and proposed what is known as the Berlin Act. The act involved partitioning Africa, and each European leader would decide the parts they wanted. As expected, they didn't get permission from African rulers to share their lands, and they took whatever they wanted and acted in ways that were savage. Around the time of this partitioning, 80% of Africa was ruled by local rulers, but by the 1990s, 90% of Africa was ruled by European powers, including Niger. 2 French officials were placed in charge of Niger. They were Paul Voulez and Julian Chanoine. Why are they important to this story? They had a similar lust for blood. Voulez and Chanoine had just one job: move from Senegal to get local intelligence from Chad and Niger to infiltrate Sudan, then come back. It was supposed to be a journey from Senegal in the west of Africa to Sudan in the east of Africa. A 2-way journey, but now that journey is called the Killer Trail, which should give you an idea of what happened. Paul Voulez was described as a true love of blood and cruelty, coupled with a sometimes foolish sensitivity, while Julian Chanoine was described as a judged, impulsive, ruthless and cruel out of cold-bloodedness as well as for pleasure. The mission was important to Voulez because it was his idea, and he had struggled so much to get the approval of French politicians. So when he embarked on this trip, he outperformed himself. Voulez's mission wasn't properly planned because despite all the men that followed him, he expected locals to do his bidding. In the first village he reached, Voulez tried to recruit the locals to work as porters to help him carry things. The villagers refused, and do you know what he did next? He razed the entire village to the ground, destroying hundreds of houses. Voulez was on an egoistic trip and wanted to show off his power with every chance he got. However, The locals weren't the only people he terrorized. Voulay didn't feed his camp members, and when he was questioned, he would kill whoever dared with a bayonet. The situation was so bad that when the French government heard, they were surprised. Imagine a colonial empire being surprised at how their people treat others. Some of Voulay's soldiers deserted him, and an order to arrest Chanoine and Voulay was released. An officer from Mali was dispatched to replace Voulay and Chanoine, and what he saw on the way to the captains shocked him. Dead girls were hanging off trees. Over 1,000 bodies lay in the open, with some of their heads ripped away by vultures. Despite this, Klob believed Voulay would hand over to him, but instead, he met his demise. Eventually, Voulay's troop turned on him and killed him and Chanoine. In light of all this, the French government continued their expedition. It seemed like they wanted to take over West Africa in a way that wasn't too gory. But their morality wasn't deep enough to protect innocent people from getting killed and stop the raid on villages. Eventually, they took over the Sahara region of Africa. They took over Mauritania, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, Benin, Togo, Guinea, and Niger. They called the region French West Africa. This entire region was bigger than France as a country, so how did they manage to control it? They used brute force. It was so bad that over 2 million Africans fought for France in the First World War and 1.2 million Africans in the Second World War. By 1949, Niger became an overseas French territory. Then, elections were introduced and political parties were formed, with the most important being the Progressive Party of Niger. There were two contenders in the party, Djibo Bakary and Hamani Diori. In 1957, France developed a new constitution which required the colonies under them to decide if they wanted to remain under France or not. Bakary wanted the colony of Niger to boycott the voting, and Diori wanted them to remain under French power. Diori wanted to be in control of Niger and best believe that he got control. He kept Niger under French rule until 1960, when the country gained independence. After the country gained independence, Diori was appointed president and he shut down every other political party. He tracked down his rivals and started ruling like an autocrat, making rules no one could change or question. The French president at the time, Charles de Gaulle, wanted to create France-Afrique to maintain their rule in West Africa, so they supported Niger by providing military support, a little aid, and the French influence. In exchange, France got access to free resources. They also stationed troops in Niger to fight terror groups, but for a country that has gained independence from your rule, isn't that too much of a reach? Since the 1980s, French presidents have promised to dissolve France-Afrique, but their actions have proven otherwise. In 1945, different African countries started to use the CFA franc as their mode of payment. Until now, it has stayed that way. While that shouldn't sound problematic, it would interest you to know that for these African countries to use the currency, 50% of their reserve is given to the French treasury in France. The currency is pegged at the same value as the euro, but it's also called monetary servitude because it's a reminder of French colonialism. It's no surprise that Niger doesn't like France. They are constantly reminded of the villages razed, women raped, children killed, and men sent off to war under France's rule. The people of Niger eventually brought an end to France rule in their country, burning the colonial masters' flags and embassy in 2023. The President of France has ordered the immediate removal of all French troops and ambassadors from Niger. This coup could be the first step Africa needs to take to get their complete freedom from indirect European rule. Is there anything you'd like to learn about our Black ancestors? Then leave a comment. please subscribe to the channel so we can keep creating more melanin-rich videos. See you next time. Peace.